I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and Volkswagen says that this car is better than the Tesla Model Y. Big claim, and in this video I'm going to explain exactly how they mean that phrase, because we know that the ID5 GTX next to me does not have the same level of performance as something like a Model Y performance. What Volkswagen says is that it rides better, it handles better. Well, we've brought it to one of the best places in the world to find out if that is true. But in this video, we're also going to check out all the things that'll be important for you if you're considering an ID4 or an ID5 as a family car, because these vehicles are going to arrive in Australia in about a year's time from now. The ID4 is a mid-size SUV, much like a Tiguan. The ID5 is a mid-size coupe SUV. Both of them have rear drive or all-wheel drive choices. They really are Volkswagen's idea of how they want to do fully electric family motoring, at least for the next few years until an electric Tiguan. So let's jump in and explore the ID5 GTX in today's video. But before we get started, hit subscribe below. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Budget Direct. Jumping into the ID5 GTX now, what we find is generally a comfortable space, and a space which is a little bit more upmarket than the Tiguan. Now, that's not a particularly high bar, because the Tiguan is probably Volkswagen's most workmanlike mainstream model, apart from maybe the Polo and the T-Cross, which are definitely low-end vehicles. Material quality was never a strong point of the current gen Tiguan. I think the ID4 and the ID5 are a step above that, but they're probably not quite as plush as what you might be expecting if you're coming out of, say, a Touareg, which is definitely still a more luxurious vehicle than the ID4 or the ID5. So what do we have? Well, we have more or less Volkswagen's outgoing version of their infotainment system. All of the basics here will remain through the ID4 and the ID5's lifespan, but we still have issues like non-illuminated sliders for the screen here and touch capacitive buttons on the steering wheel. Both of those things are on their way to a fix, and I think they might be fixed by the time the ID4 and the ID5 arrive in Australia. That question hasn't been answered, but it is a key one, I think. That said, Volkswagen's aware of it, they're working on it, and the rest of the system actually works quite well, because early on in this car's lifespan, it had a processor upgrade, at least one upgrade, maybe two, and that's meant that lag has been pretty much eliminated from this system, and it's been very snappy over the last few days when we've been testing the car. The wireless smartphone connection has also been rock solid, and even though this car doesn't have the premium stereo, the audio quality is pretty good. A Harman Kardon will be available in Australia. Now, we are in Europe, and in Europe you can get some rather strange specifications on cars, because this GTX is high spec in many ways. Big wheels, sunroof, IQ matrix LED lights, but then we have manual cloth seats. Now, that combination would never come to Australia, even though it's very cool. And an interesting thing about the manually adjustable seats in the ID5 is that you can get much, much lower into the car than the electric seat. The seat itself is very comfortable. It's got these dinky little armrests, which is kind of a bit Range Rover-y, and doing long drives in this car is very doable. Perhaps the thing that goes without saying is that the interior design is the anti-Tesla Model Y, and in many ways the whole ID5 concept is the anti-Model Y, and I'll explain more of that when we take this car for a drive. But you've still got one-touch access to a bunch of controls here, whereas obviously in the Model Y, everything is driven through the touchscreen. Now, in terms of those materials, soft on the doors, soft on the dash, a little bit of hard touch if you start looking sort of below that belt line there, but heaps of storage throughout the center console here, even more room underneath this center console here because we are on a dedicated electric platform. So all in all, it's comfortable, visibility out is good, and quality is reasonable, if not outright plush. The ID5 and the ID4 both have a pretty long wheelbase, and that means that space in the back is excellent. Legroom is good, headroom is acceptable for myself at 6 foot, and toe room is decent, even with that manual seat set very low. You could get a third person in the center, even though it is a bit of a perch. It's worth keeping in mind that even the ID4 is not available with a third row. We're still waiting on a 3-row electric SUV from Volkswagen. I think there is one in China, but it's not sold outside that market. In terms of amenities back here, you do have pockets in the back of those seats. We've got a flip down armrest with 2.5 cup holders and a ski hatch, especially useful because the GTX has all-wheel drive, and you do get USB ports and air vents, but they're very low. Because the ID5 basically doesn't really have a traditional center console, it just has storage almost in the floor, there isn't an obvious place to site the air vents in the center. My concern is that, you know, putting kids in and out of the car, they're gonna trample that and break it, and that's why I think that B-pillar air vents probably would have been a better idea for the second row, but we'll see how it fares over time. Moving around the back of the ID5 GTX now, you'll spot a GTX because not only does it say GTX, which is a bit of a giveaway, but GTX is also in black. Regular ID5s and ID4s have a white badge on the back to match their flat, sort of two-dimensional looking white and black Volkswagen logo. Now the ID5 being the more coupe styled version of these two SUVs means you are obviously going to lose some vertical cargo room. So for myself, I'd probably go for an ID4 because if you're buying a car like this, practicality is probably the name of the game. That being said, I think the swoopily styled ID5 is going to appeal to quite a lot of people, and you also get this spoiler here, plus a powered tailgate, which gets out of the way quickly and quietly, revealing 549 litres of boot space. So a little bit down on something like a Tiguan, but still reasonably spacious. You'll get 2 or 3 suitcases in there, bit of extra storage underneath the boot floor, for a good area for charging cables, that sort of thing, but no spare. Bit of a giveaway when you look at the enormous wheels on this car, and it also has big brakes in GTX form, but so many EVs run without any kind of spare whatsoever. We'd really love to see some improvement on that front in Australia. Now, when it comes to efficiency, the ID5 GTX is going to be thirstier than the rear-wheel drive model, and I have been able to simulate a highway range test with this car over here in Europe. At an average of just under 100 kilometers per hour, this ID5 GTX consumed 16.8 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers from its 77 kilowatt hour usable battery. That's a real-world highway range of 458 kilometers. Of course, we'll reconfirm those tests in Australia when the full suite of ID4 and ID5 models arrives locally. What I can tell you though is that that is pretty similar to a Model Y rear drive or a Model Y performance in terms of its real-world range. How it's going to go in town though is still up in the air. So driving the ID5 GTX, fascinating time to be driving this car because it'll be landing in Australia in about 12 months alongside the ID4 GTX and also a rear-wheel drive version of both cars. What does GTX mean? Well, it means kind of GTI level performance, but with all-wheel drive. We know that Volkswagen will have GTI EVs, but they have front-wheel drive. And we know that Volkswagen will almost certainly have R EVs with all-wheel drive and more power than a GTX. So you can start to see the taxonomy coming together, right? So what does it mean for the ID5? Well, for 2023 at least, it means that the GTX is a dual-motor all-wheel drive car with 220 kilowatts of power and 460 Newton meters of torque. So not mind-blowing numbers for an EV, but a comfortable amount of power. However, almost certain that this car is going to be getting a power bump for 2024 before it arrives in Australia. It might also get a light facelift at the same time. Now that power bump would almost certainly be to 250 kilowatts of power and 545 Newton meters of torque, just like the ID5 GTX's close cousin, the Cupra Tavascan. It's especially the case because Volkswagen Australia has already confirmed that for 2024, the rear-wheel drive version of this car will have 210 kilowatts of power and 545 Newton meters of torque. So you would never have the GTX being less torquey than the rear drive. Something has to change. But I can certainly tell you what it feels like with today's amount of power, and you can probably assume it'll have even more go. And that's good because I think it could use a bit more power. It's comfortable, it's adequate, and on this beautiful mountain pass that we're driving here, it never felt slow, it just doesn't feel outright fast. I think if you were coming from something like a Tiguan 162 TSI though, an ID4 or an ID5 GTX is going to feel really comfortable and really normal, and that's part of what Volkswagen will be selling in the ID4 and the ID5, in that this EV is really normal and easy to drive, and it's quite car-like or normal car-like in that sense. The way the power is delivered, like that, you know, you're not sort of shoved into the back of the seat. It's more linear. There's a little pause before the car takes off, and those that are speed demons will probably prefer the Tesla Model Y performance, for instance, which would be a bit more expensive than this car, I think, but it has much more electrifying performance, pardon the pun, whereas the Volkswagen has been tuned to make things a bit more comfortable. That said, we're likely to get a bit more of a hit from the motors when the 2024 model is eventually unveiled. But what this car does really well is it provides a nice balanced chassis tune. And that really comes through on roads like this, which is a super road, you know, much more technical than anything we have in Australia. But we've got reasonably nice steering with an intuitive ratio, if not the last word in feel. What we've got is a beautifully done suspension, You've got to fine tune it though. In the default comfort mode, it's a bit jittery at the wheels, but you can go into an individual mode and do the damper settings yourself. And if you take it all the way past comfort to like a uber comfort level, the jitters go away and you're not really losing much body control because we've got a big heavy 77 kilowatt hour battery between the axles, which keeps things rather planted. You've still got to have a bit of patience because the tire grip is just okay. You can push it into understeer if you're really trying, but likewise, you can correct on the throttle, as I just did, the attitude of the rear axle, because even though we have all-wheel drive, the ID5 GTX has the dominant motor on the back. So it's not going to do big power slides, but you can just nip your line in really nicely. And that's something that a Tiguan doesn't really let you do because it's more dominant to front drive than rear drive. So that's really, really pleasant. It's also not uncanny in terms of its flatness in the corners like some EVs. The Tesla Model Y, for instance, is a bit of a one-trick pony in that it's got really quick steering and very flat dynamics. That can feel a bit uncanny as a driver, but it also does encourage more understeer. And the ID5 GTX, the chassis helps you out, helps you lean into corners a little bit more. It's a bit more body roll, but it's not at the expense of handling. In fact, it enhances it a little bit because it's taking some of that pressure off the tires in this car. And you can really get into it on a great road like this. And I think the rear wheel drive will be even better in that sense, if not quite as quick. You do have some element of regen braking if you put it into B mode with the direction selector up here, but it's not true one pedal driving. We'll see whether that might be a future update for this car. Refinement is generally very good, very low levels of wind noise. The motor is extremely smooth and quiet, but there is some tire resonance. We've got quite a fat tire on this GTX model, so that would be the cause of that. That being said, when the ID3 got its upgrade this year, refinement was improved, so we may see that in the ID4 and 5 when they get their upgrade as well. Point being, this exact version of the car is not what we're getting in Australia. Aussies will get an upgraded version of the ID4 in both rear drive, ID4 and 5 in both rear drive and GTX. So this car is pretty good. I think what we're going to be receiving in Australia is even better. In terms of whether it's worth trying to put a deposit in or order one as soon as that is announced and made available, I think if you are a customer of Volkswagen already, if you've got a Tiguan or a Touareg or a Golf Wagon or a Passat and you've loved that car and you've loved the way it drives in particular, you're going to be interested in the ID4 and 5 if you're ready to move to an EV, because by and large, the biggest thing I can say about this car is that it is clearly a Volkswagen EV. That's what it's designed to be. Volkswagen has not targeted a carbon copy of the Tesla Model Y. What they've done is they've thought about how can we take what the Tiguan does well and turn it into a fully electric SUV. And that's exactly the characteristic of the ID5 GTX that I'm driving right now. And to be honest, I like it. Does it thrash Tesla on power, range, charging speed? No, it doesn't. Tesla still has efficiencies and leads in some of those areas. Where the Tesla arguably trails some of its competitors is in some of the quality of the driving dynamics, and I think that's one area where Volkswagen's traditional expertise does shine through. Whether that is more important to you than some of those quantitative EV bona fides is very much up to you. In terms of safety, we've got the full set, of course. Skoda Enyaq just came past, this car's cousin. We have adaptive cruise control, we've got lane keep assist, blind spot monitoring. It all works pretty well. The lane keep assist can be a little bit snappy, but it is easy to turn off. This car's lovely and balanced. I've had fun driving it, and that's good for a midsize SUV. So colour me interested. So that's my first impression of the Volkswagen ID5 GTX, a midsize SUV coming to Australia in about 12 months' time. Now, I am pleasantly surprised with how this car drives. It has an engaging chassis, it's got good ride quality, it's got high levels of refinement, and even though I do think it could use a little bit more power, it's comfortable. Plus, we think the power bump is coming anyway. The crucial element, of course, will be price. Now, Volkswagen is aggressively going after the Tesla Model Y with this car. They say that supply is going to be good. They say they understand the price positioning needs to be very competitive with Tesla, but Volkswagen does warn that while Tesla has some available options which can drive up the price, the ID5s are going to arrive more highly specified. So the actual price could be above the Model Y, but once you include the options, maybe it'll make good sense. We'll have to wait and see when the car drops in Australia. That's my view. Let me know yours down below in the comments. While you're there, hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.